Let's first look at what we recall in matrimony. So matrimony is ultimately going to be a reflection of the Trinity. So remember from the very first unit when we talked about the Trinity is a relationship. So we have God the Father loving God the Son, and the shared love in between them is the Holy Spirit, which spirates forth, proceeds forth from both. In a similar way, marriage is the way it is, not because of Adam and Eve. A lot of times people equate marriage to Adam and Eve. That's actually not the case. The reason why we believe marriage is what it is because it's meant to reflect the Trinity, that it is a communion of persons, just like the Trinity is a communion of persons. And so marriage by its nature has to bring individuals together that is in a way that is both unitive, it joins them together, and generative, so that's life-giving, both in a general way that it helps bring the individuals in that marriage to a better place in their lives, to give them a better sense of life, but also in a very literal way in that their marriage can be fruitful in producing children and child rearing. So we have a sense then that reflects the Trinity. We have a husband loving the wife, wife loving the husband, and from their shared love usually comes forth a child oftentimes, or maybe not in physically having a child if they're unable to, an idea of adopting a child and sharing that love with that child. So we see this family unit, husband, wife, and child, as a literal, quite literal reflection of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So in this way too, marriage is called to be a covenant. It's not a contract. So when we see marriage as kind of a civil contract, so someone who is civilly married, they enter into a contract. And like any contract, it's can be seen, at least from the state's perspective, maybe not in the couple's perspective, but in the state's perspective, really a goods for services. You know, we've entered into this contract, and if things go well, we keep the contract, just like you might keep a contract with a service provider. But if we don't feel like the service that we want is being provided, we can end the contract. The church sees marriage a little differently. It sees it not as a contract, but as a covenant. And we see throughout Scripture, God makes this covenant with His people, where He makes this sacred agreement, where I will be your God, you will be my people, and we will always be faithful to this covenant. So in a similar way, marriage is entering into a covenant. Not simply a contract, which is goods for services, but a covenant, a lifelong and solemn bond. And that's why we see this bond as indissoluble or unbreakable, because it is something that leaves an indelible mark in our soul, something that we enter into with God. Because of this covenant is also seen as a living sign of the gospel. So just like marriage is seen to be a reflection of the nature of the Trinity, so too it's supposed to be a sign of a sacrament to the world, where by seeing people's marriages, we should be able to see God's love for children, God's love for spouses, God's fidelity to us in the fidelity that they have for one another. We also see in marriage God's plan for human complementarity, that man and woman, as we mentioned in the last module, have equal dignity. One is not greater than the other. Unfortunately, in the past, passages have been used in Scripture to say that somehow women are less than men or men are above women. That is very much not the case. It is not church teaching. It is not scripturally based that women are less than men. Very much so, men and women have equal dignity, and even in their differences, complete one another, both in their different emotional psychological differences, but also in their physical differences can quite literally come together as one flesh, as Jesus reminds us, and as John Paul II reminds us in Theology of the Body, that they quite literally complement one another. So we see that reflected in the theology behind the sacrament of matrimony. And we see as much in Jesus' words in the Gospel of Matthew, that for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So one word on this, I know we might all come from different backgrounds, different situations, and I know for some individuals they might be a part of a different kind of family or a blended family, and by no means are we looking down on someone who might not have this idea of a family of a father and a mother. And Pope Francis in his encyclical Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love, talks about that the church is called to serve and minister to any kind and every kind of family. That in each case that God calls every kind of family to that loving union and to be a sign of the gospel. So while we're looking at this as a theology of marriage and as the basis of marriage, if you will, let that not be a case for being made to feel inferior, or as if that, for example, if you're living in a situation your parents aren't together anymore, that somehow they don't love you, or they can't be a sign of God's love to you as well. That is certainly not the case. Clearly, we don't know what goes on in other people's lives. I don't know what goes on in other people's lives and in your family, so I'm not here to by any means to cast a judgment. And myself, I'm trying to figure out marriage. I am by no means a perfect individual or perfect spouse, so I'm not here trying to stand on the pedestal. The church on its own hand also speaks of divorce in a couple ways. So in terms of divorce, that can always be a difficult subject in terms of the church's teachings. One of the reasons why the church teaches against divorce, again, is the sense of marriage as a covenant, that we enter into a very much a binding covenant, that it's not simply dating, that, if we fall out of love or we somehow don't want to put the time and effort anymore, that we can just leave. And for that reason, the church requires all individuals who are preparing for marriage to enter into a pre-cane or preparation program to really see, do you understand what you're getting into? Do you understand what is being asked of you? And is this really the right person? So that way, if there is any issues, you can kind of hopefully catch it ahead of time. The church, though, does also understand that at times different things occur. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops did release, and you can go on their website to see it, they released a statement where saying they never expect an individual to stay in an unhealthy or abusive relationship. By no means does the church ask that of anyone. Oftentimes in the past, some people may have stayed in an unhealthy or abusive relationship because they're afraid of divorce, but in no means does the church require or expect someone to stay in that situation. If anything, they see that by that unhealthiness and that by abuse or violence, that individual has already broken the marriage vow. And so they simply invite those individuals who might find themselves in that situation to first seek help, seek support, seek safety, that the church is here as a safe haven, but also to perhaps seek an annulment. So there's a difference here between what we may call a divorce and annulment. So in the moment of marriage, we're going to see, as it currently is in this country, two things occur. So you go to a marriage ceremony, a marriage ritual, and you might see one thing. You see the priest, you see the husband and wife, they exchange vows. But there's actually two separate things going on. As far as the state is concerned, there is a civil marriage that is occurring. So to be married, you need to have a marriage license that you'll get from your town hall that then needs to be signed. And the priest is understood as a justice of the peace. And so you're civilly married. As far as the church is concerned, there's a covenant that is being forged between bride and groom, which the priest or deacon is simply a witness of the church for. And so there's a sacramental bond that is made. So there's two things, a civil marriage and a sacramental marriage. So since two things occur at marriage at that moment of the ceremony, to end it, two things would need to occur. A divorce, a civil divorce, would end a civil marriage, but it is simply not enough to have a civil divorce. We would also need an annulment to nullify the sacramental marriage. So annulment is simply saying that at the moment of that ceremony, there is something that impeded it from being fully valid or fully true. And so there will usually be this investigation process to question the couples and their friends to understand, was everyone in the right place of mind? Was everything good? So for example, we're going to see that the consent of the bride and groom is essential to the marriage. And you can't consent to something that you don't fully know about. For example, I know of an individual who received an annulment because after they were married, different things kind of came out about the other individual that became very detrimental to the marriage and to the health of the marriage. So they ended up divorcing because of the strain that those things had on their marriage. And eventually the church gave them an annulment, recognizing that impediment that caused them to have to cause hurt and to cause for an unhealthy sense of that marriage. Not to say that they were bad individuals, but that they could recognize that that one spouse could not fully consent to something that they did not know about. So that might be an example of an annulment in the church. But we don't start there as a starting point. No one goes into marriage saying, hopefully this will last only a couple of years and after that I'll move on. We all enter the marriage hopefully with that sense of having a lifelong love and a lifelong relationship. And that is reflected in the sense of what we understand the basis of marriage to be, just like God is that loving one relationship, that this couple becomes that one flesh. We see that as much in Paul's writings. I want to point out Ephesians 5 because unfortunately a lot of times it's misused. Before this passage that's on the screen, there's a passage that talks about wives being subservient to their husbands, and oftentimes that's used to say that husbands are the dominating force in a family. And by no means should that be the case. It should be an equal partnership, an equal working together of complementarity to help one another be the best version of themselves. So really for the rest of my life, I'm called to make my wife the best version of herself, and she's called to make me the best version of myself, that she has gifts and talents that I don't have, and that hopefully that she brings out in me and I in her. Really, when we're looking at Paul's image of marriage, we're looking at this idea of, yes, service, but look at how he talks about husbands. He talks, husbands, love your wives the way Christ loved the church, giving himself up to her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle, or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. So think of it this way. Paul is challenging husbands to love their wives like their very selves, like their own bodies. And he says, love your wives like Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? He gave his body as a sacrifice on the cross. He suffered whipping and beatings. He suffered ridicule, nails through his hands and through his feet, hanging on a cross in agony for 3 hours, losing every drop of blood and his very last breath for the church. And Paul says, husbands, that's how you should love your wife. So for some girls listening to this, if you're don't settle. If you're looking for someone that will treat you right, wait for someone that would lay down their life for you, and don't settle for anything less, quite frankly. And this goes for both individuals. Seek after someone, wait for someone who will lay down their life for you. Don't simply settle to be with someone. Sometimes we just have this anxiousness of, I don't want to be alone. I don't want to be lonely. Well, I'll put this out to you. Dating ends only one of two ways. Either you marry the person or you break up. So if we're honest with ourselves, when we're dating someone, what are we doing? Are we discerning marriage, or are we just kind of, don't want to be lonely or using each other? What are we doing? Let's be honest with ourselves. Are we loving each other like Christ loved the church, or would I lay my life down for this person? And if so, it might be worth, not wasting their time in a certain way. Yes, it's important to discern, but we have to also be honest about what are we doing. So in a similar way, just as you date intentionally, marriage should also be intentional, of a husband laying down, sacrificing his life for his bride. And that's the kind of love that marriage should have, a sacrificial love. That means when you wake up on a given day, you might not feel like you're in love. You might feel like loving that person. There are certainly mornings where I might struggle to do the things my wife asks me, or I might be frustrated with my wife, and I'm sure different times that she's frustrated with me. But at the end of the day, I love her not because how I feel every morning, because feelings change, feelings are fickle. But rather, I remember my marriage vows where I promised to love and honor her, to put her first before myself, to serve her, to sacrifice for her, and now my child. And those vows, that promise, is what keeps me even on my worst days in that loving relationship. And so too, we're called in that way to love, because Christ is always faithful, and we're called to always be faithful. So let's look at how this is reflected in the marriage ritual. And for your viewing pleasure, here's some pictures of my own wedding. Figured why not? We're looking at the marriage ritual. So marriage can be celebrated in one of two ways. It can be celebrated within Mass, and that's usually the ideal. Mass is a celebration of Thanksgiving. And so the best way is to celebrate that marriage in that offering of Thanksgiving Eucharist. It can be celebrated outside of Mass. In that case, there will usually be a liturgy of the Word, and then the rest of what we're going to see here. To be married in the church, ideally both spouses should be fully initiated into the church, receiving baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist. but at the very least, one individual needs to be a baptized Catholic. So there are different amendments to the ritual and different things that have to be discussed leading up in the preparation process if one of the individuals is not Catholic or Christian, but it is ultimately allowed to receive ultimately the sacrament and to have that ceremony, only as long as one of the individuals is baptized. Ultimately, what is needed for the sacrament to be valid is the consent of the bride and groom. We're going to see that this is going to be the matter of the sacrament, mainly because the church does not allow for arranged marriages. This is something that is freely given. Love is freely given, freely received, and so the couple has to freely give themselves. So actually, this idea of the bride being given away by the father is actually, while it's turned into a sentimental tradition, it's actually very much a kind of confusing sign and a misnomer, because the bride is not given away. The bride is not property. The bride gives herself away. If the bride was actually being given away, it would be an invalid sacrament. So both give themselves freely. Afterwards, it is also, according to church law, canon law, the couple must consummate or have intercourse. And the reason for that is because intercourse is a sacrament in and of itself. It's in the sense that it is a sign of that marriage. So at the altar, the bride and groom unite one another in those vows to one another, that they approach the altar as two individuals, and at the altar they become one family. They're still individuals, but they become one family, a person, as Jesus says, that they united themselves together through their vows, that they now complete one another and together form one image of the Trinity. So likewise, intercourse is going to be a visible sign where husband and wife quite literally become one flesh. And so church law requires that after the marriage takes place at some point, that the marriage is consummated. Now, there is the ability, for example, if they're not, for some way, shape, or form, are not physically able to consummate the marriage, they are able to be given what's called a dispensation. So that requirement is kind of waived. But that's only usually in very rare situations where there's a physical impediment. But usually, or often not, couples are asked to both express their union together in the sacrament and then to consummate afterwards. The ordinary minister, for that reason, is actually not the priest or deacon. The priest or deacon is simply a witness of the church to say this is a valid sacrament. The ordinary minister is actually the bride and groom, and the reason is the priest is not entering into the covenant with the spouses. The bride and groom are forging the covenant with each other, with God. So because of that, the bride and groom are the ministers of that sacrament. So once we get past the liturgy of the word and we celebrate the liturgy of the word, we have this general questioning of the couple, and the priest is going to ask the couple 3 questions. And one's going to be a question of, do they give themselves freely and willingly here, and they have to say yes, establishing consent. Then a question of, will they honor one another and being faithful to one another, that this isn't just a sacrament of good feelings, but a sacrament of being faithful to each other for the rest of their lives, till death do us part, and they hopefully will say, I do. And then there'll be a question of, will they openly and willingly receive children from God and raise them according to Christ's laws and the laws of the church. And this comes to that part of marriage being generative, is at the very least being open to children. It's not saying how many children to have, but simply to be open to the gift of children, because that is also one of the effects, the great effects of marriage. And children are generally a great gift. Having a child myself, it is a great gift. And so they ask that question of at least having that openness to having children. Next, we look at the kind of key form and matter of the sacrament. So then we have the formal declaration of consent, which is what we call the conjugal vows. I take thee, so-and-so, to be my lawfully wedded wife or husband. I promise to honor you in sickness and in health, and richer and poorer, for better or worse. And note those words. Those words are very important. It's why the church doesn't allow individuals to write their own vows, that they say the same vows, because they're very simple and concise, but they very much clearly summarize what the sacrament of marriage and that covenant is about. That I promise to be faithful to my spouse in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, knowing very well it could be in sickness, poorer, or worse, all at the same time. So this covenant I'm entering in, it's not a fair weather covenant, only when things are going good, but rather I'm promising myself to this individual to help them reach heaven. So my goal for the rest of my life is to help my wife and my children get to heaven before me. And the goal of my wife is to help myself and her and our children to get to heaven. And that can be a really difficult thing because we're saying, to put someone else first. Well, how do I know that I'm not going to be taken care of? That is the vulnerability of marriage. But the ideal is that if each individual puts the other first, that there will be this idea of self-giving, of other-centeredness, of genuine love, and they'll hold each other up. So if you think of a teepee that has 3 poles that hold up the marriage, God is one pole, and He'll always hold His end of the bargain. But to uphold the teepee that is marriage, you need all 3 poles. So God will always uphold His, but both spouses also need to uphold theirs, and together they'll uphold this family, will uphold this marriage unit in good times and in bad. And that is also hopefully the role of our larger extended families in the community to help give support and be there for marriages, even if it's in difficult times. These vows are essentially going to express that consent. So remember, we talked about the consent as the matter of the sacrament. It's ultimately the bridegroom consenting to this marriage that makes it valid. Then, as a sign of this consent and a sign of this love and fidelity, we exchange rings. So the rings are a sign of their fidelity. Here's my ring. It's circular. And it's the idea that my fidelity to my wife should be never-ending, unwavering, just like the circle is infinite. It never ends. So before we were married, this ring was simply a ring. I got it from a jeweler. It had a monetary value. But now this is holy. This is a sacramental. It's a sacred sign. I can't just now go give it away or throw it in the trash. This is something that's been blessed. And so this is now a visible and physical reminder of my fidelity that I promised to my wife for the rest of my life. And so I wear always, and so whenever I see it and it tugs on me, it's a reminder of my need to be faithful and loving and respectful to my wife, to put her and my family first. Lastly, there's what we call the nuptial blessing. So in Mass, this would be said during the liturgy of the Eucharist. If it's celebrated outside of Mass, this would be pretty much the last blessing given before the concluding prayer. And it's basically going to be a blessing where the priest prays for God's love and grace on the couple, for God to bless this marriage. It's going to recall the base of marriage. It's going to pray for each spouse individual and for the spouses as a whole. Some people may ask, well, maybe a couple is married civilly, can they receive the sacrament? The answer is yes. So if a couple is married civilly, but then later decide they want to have their marriage sacramentally blessed, they can receive what's called a convalidation, where they will receive the sacrament part of it. They wouldn't be remarried, so to speak, but they would reaffirm their consent and vows to the church, and they would receive this nuptial blessing. So how does marriage affect those who receive it? So it gives sanctifying grace, and it's really going to draw this couple together in a couple ways. It's going to draw them together with each other. So this idea, again, of unitive, that marriage is called to bring two individuals quite literally together in a union of marriage. And this is going to help them live out their marriage vows. They're going to be strengthened to be other-centered, as I was just talking about, to give themselves to the other, to put the other first, to sacrifice for the other, especially when it's hard. It's also going to unite them closer to Christ. Notice all the sacraments, one of the effects is uniting with Christ. And so it's going to help them have Christ at the center of their marriage, especially in those most difficult times, that having Christ and God at the center of a marriage helps really to strengthen them, because Christ is going to give them the grace and help them to kind of refocus, to say, this really isn't about us, it's about each other. And if we're hurting one another, we're really not loving the way Christ wants us to love. So to put Christ at the center is to put each other at the center as well. And in this way, it's going to really reflect the Trinity. So it's uniting them with each other and uniting them with God. So we have this other secondary Trinity, if you will, of the spouses and God. And this way, it's going to also help them live out the Paschal mystery, that in their times of suffering or in their times of difficulty, they can lift up those sufferings and difficulty together and be united with Christ and find new life in the resurrection. Remember to not put focus on simply comfort or me, myself, and I, but to focus on the other, and then that genuine love, if it is genuine, that will mean for a very happy and very fulfilling life. We also see this idea of marriage as a community. So there's my family, my son, who was only a couple weeks old in that picture. He's much older now. But marriage also unites them together as a family. So again, the idea of being generative, that that a couple can now have children, and in that children in having children, reflect to them God's love. So they come together in what we call the domestic church. That the domestic church is the local church, that parents are called to be the first teachers of the faith and the first experience of the faith that individuals have. We also are called together to be united with the church. So marriage is a sacrament of service. So through our marriage, through having a family, that we can serve the church, not only in growing the church, but also in being a part of the parish community and dedicating our time and our efforts as a family to help the church in its mission. And lastly, to society, Pope John Paul II famously said, if the family goes, so does the nation. Very much, family is a very unique institution in the sense that everything in society is geared towards the service of the family unit. And so in many ways, the family and the couple are united to society and are called to not only grow society, but also called to, through their marriage, to be a visible sign of God's love, to be a visible sign of peace, of justice, of the kingdom of God in the world, and that through our family, through the way we live our life day in and day out, to be an example of others, of how to treat others, of how to love others, how to serve others. So that is, in essence, the sacrament of matrimony and what it calls individuals to. I now invite you to complete the module materials for this week. And if you have any questions, comments, clarifications, please feel free to contact me and let me know. But until next time, we'll see you then.